Good afternoon, buenas tardes.
Thank you very much for attending this meeting. It is very important for us to share with the news, to share with media, those who covers the UN. We want to be very brief. We have very important information to share. We're here because due to the establishment of yesterday's International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. It is a date very important, 24 April, for celebrating, commemorating every year. It is beautiful. At a time when unilateralism is attempting to those countries who are facing God knows how many death and destruction on the last years. Now the non-aligned movement, upon a proposal from its chair, Venezuela, proposed the General Assembly to adopt a date to establish multilateralism and diplomacy for peace. I mean, all that is in face of the doctrine that has been tried to be imposed by the United States to implement a unilateral doctrine around the world and even within the United Nations. You must recall that a couple of weeks ago, the Vice President of the U.S., Mike Pence, came to the Security Council, which met due to the situation in Venezuela. Without having listened to any other intervention, he sat down and started to repeat his statement and his discourse of domination on the basis of the Monroe Doctrine about the appropriation of Venezuela's resources. And at that time, they highlighted that they will achieve at the UN that the credentials of the Venezuelan delegations will be revoked by the majority of the delegations, then recognizing that they are in an extortion and coercion strategy to impose their dictatorship even within the UN. The response of the UN, of the vast majority of the United Nations, was precisely the establishment of yesterday's meeting, which concluded today in the commemoration of the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace, which coincides with the date of the conclusion of that Afro-Asian conference in 1955, which served as the basis for establishing the non-aligned movement and its 10 Bandung principles, which are the same as those contained in the UN Charter. But now I want to share with you something different. We're coming here to denounce, to make an important denounce. It's something we shared yesterday with the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. We want to share, we will share it today with the PGA, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, and which we have been doing. President Maduro has been doing so. It is our time to declare ourselves in campaign for the denounce, for the world to know and understand the devastating effects of the unilateral, illegal blockade, arbitrary blockade that the U.S. government has imposed on Venezuela for now over 4 years, formally since 2017, and which have effectively had consequences, humane consequences, in lives, in suffering. And we will explain on the basis of this information. You know that this started with President Barack Obama, who signed the executive order on 8 March 2015, declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to its national security, to the people of the U.S. What an affirmation, a baseless affirmation. Venezuela is not a threat for no country, no neighbor country, much less for the U.S., the most powerful country around the world. It was the framework for a much more extremist government as that from President Trump to approve and issue decrees, executive orders from President Trump with sanctions. I will not refer here to sanctions targeting individuals, because that has been a game of the right wing and the Venezuelan right wing opposition, because they say that the sanctions are not against the economy, but they're targeted against individuals. That's fake. They do exist, but they do not have any repercussion, because these members of the state do not have any properties in the US or in Canada. That's something, it's a hatred sign against individuals, members of the administration. What do have an effect is the sanctions against our economy, and we have to say it in this way. The social model of the Venezuelan revolution, which Commander Chavez developed, when we take away the income from oil to the right wing and to the transnational in the US and their government, starting in 1999, please recall 1991, 2000, 2001, 2002, the coup d'etat. Given the big differences between the bourgeoisie and the revolution for controlling the national income, it's either for the government, for the state and the people, or for the bourgeoisie. If it's on the people, then it will be invested in health, education, housing, infrastructure, culture, investment for production, which is what President Chavez did with his development plan, his national plan, Simón Bolívar, to invest the resources of the state on the people. With the doctors who used to be Cuban, but they now are Venezuelans all around the country, the centers for comprehensive diagnosis, the schools, free education system with education even for master degrees from kindergarten, elementary school, high school, college, and even master's degree. Education is free in Venezuela because the resources were invested on our social policy. It is not the same model as in Vietnam or Chinese. It's the Venezuelan socialism, the Bolivarian model. You must take a look at the statistics of any other nation and how the revolution flourished, and Venezuelans had their human rights guaranteed. The attacks of these sanctions, well known as sanctions, but they do not have any authority to sanction any other country, any moral authority to do so. That's the model that they're implementing at the heart of our model, because they want to say that our model is not working and it cannot provide for the well-being of the Venezuelan people from a socialist standpoint. It's bombing. It's a war. It's a war on information, a diplomatic warfare. And you're well aware of it here at the UN, at the OAS, which thankfully we are withdrawing. We took that decision 2 years ago, something that will happen this coming Saturday, and we will be out of the organization. The US and their satellite governments gave a fight there. There's also an economic warfare that is there, and there's a real war for financing violence, conspiration, for a coup d'etat, for financing parallel governments, for training attempts of assassination against the president and high-level officials from the government. Those sanctions, that blockade, has hampered the national development and the capacity to import. We have millions, I will demonstrate it in the coming minutes, the millions of euros and dollars that we have blocked in international banks. It's very curious because in this economic warfare, it's not only the United States and its public institutions, but it's also the pressure against the financial sector, against the private banking, which is fundamentally private, to reject and to work with Venezuela. they have to reject working with Venezuela so that they do not dare working with Venezuela. It's something that experts call the overcompliance. And even though it's not expressly said in the executive orders, the financial institutions, they fear whenever they see sanctions against Venezuela. And every time they see the name of our country, they do not want to work with us. Even if it's for financing health, vaccinations, food, it is a cruel criminal aggression against Venezuela. Just to go quickly over these numbers, there have been some remarks from the U.S. State Department. This was in January, and someone said the campaign of pressure is working. Financial sanctions against the government of Venezuela have made it to become into default. Even in PDVSA, and what we're seeing, it's a total collapse, an economic collapse in Venezuela. Then our policy is working, our strategy is working. This is something that a staff, a member of the State Department said. Well, the strategy is working because the economy is suffering. But what about the suffering of the people? Because there are no medicines, no vaccination sometimes because of the blockade against the resources. Is that possible to accept in the world at this time? Which authority has the UN invested upon the United States to violate this charter, the Article 2.4 or Article 41? Because the Security Council has not taken any decision to sanction Venezuela. It has not taken any. So how could the U.S. say that they sanction with a blockade, an unjust blockade against our country without fulfilling the procedures of this charter, which we must respect because the UN, it's a member, or is it not? How could you be seated in a chair in the Security Council? The headquarters is in U.S. territory, and then you are not respecting the minimum provisions of this charter. We have to ask this to ourselves. Now, to go very quickly over this, executive order, I want you to go over this in detail. You who are listening to us from Latin America, all transactions for finding financing resources for the Republic are forbidden for devs, bonds, credits, drafts, acception of bankers, invoices, and commercial bonds. All this is to impede that we can do transactions to buy, to import for our people. Another executive order, it forbids the financing and other transactions in whatever currency, even digital currencies. That was to impact a currency we were creating, the Petro, to do transactions without being hit by the blockade. Well, Petro wasn't even established, and President Trump was signing an executive order to impede that it would work. But it has been working, and we will soon see it in action. Another executive order forbidding transactions in which assets from the government are put as collateral. In which Venezuelan state has 50% or over of the actions in those assets. Those cannot be part of a collateral for financing Venezuela. This is another executive order that includes the national development of Venezuela and institutions in which that bank has over 50% of property. That's the Vandes in Uruguay, the Bicentenario Bank in Venezuela, and the Bank of Venezuela, which is the largest bank institution in Venezuela. and another bank in Bolivia. We cannot use Venezuelan public banking to do transactions, to import. We cannot use dollar. Dollar is forbidden in Venezuela. To use it is forbidden. We have we have had to switch to other more volatile as the RON. That has a consequence of over a million lost in resources. There's an offensive against Venezuela. And most recently, there was another round of sanctions, another set of sanctions. They're very proud of them. These ones are against the Central Bank of Venezuela, forbidding that it makes transactions in US dollar. Who would think to attack the treasury, the central bank of a country? So it cannot fulfill with importation of goods and services to fulfill the needs of the population. It is, as what Mr. Abrams said, I have said it publicly, that now the coup has failed. They are going for the economic collapse of our nation. But what about the kids, the children, patients with HIV, with chemotherapy, with dialysis? What about surgeries that have to be suspended? I live this here for the reflection. There's also a financial aggression. Also targeting the financing of programs in Venezuela, another set of sanctions for paying bonds of public debt and having access to the sources for funding and financing. We don't have any source of financing at any international body because the U.S. do not want for that. But what about if we need the financing for the development of the country, for more employment, for infrastructure, for building hospitals, railways? We do not have any right to development. Isn't the right to development one of the principles of the United Nations? How could you achieve this? How could it be possible that you forbid this? By applying each of these strategies, and in most cases, with an extraterritorial implication, not only here in the U.S. They're not only forbidding U.S. Nationals, but they also apply it beyond their borders, and they put pressure on their allies and their satellites in various regions of the world, so that Venezuela is forbidden from accessing the markets and getting financial resources in a currency different. What's the time from a flight from Venezuela? 4 hours and a half. We are in the zone of influence of the U.S. Well, then we are forbidden from using the U.S. dollar. That's the dictatorship. That's the dictatorship they want to impose. They have tried to affect the resources of the state.
Que hubo en Venezuela.
They had access to the currencies through the only way that you could obtain currencies. Now the accounts are being closed. Now it's they're denied the way of procuring financing into the world, not only Venezuela. The closing of corresponding banks. Do you know how? We haven't said hi to our Minister for Indigenous People, Aloha Nunes, who's here in the intercultural section of indigenous populations. Do you know how difficult it is for us to pay the salaries of our staff in United Nations or Europe or in Canada? We have delays of 5-6 months. We don't have. It's not that we don't have the money. It's that the money is blocked in corresponding banks. It's that from one day to another, they take the money. It's not that they give it back, it's that they take the money. We can't do the transaction. We're scared of the United States and the sanctions, and we'll give you money back. No, they keep the money. I'll show you some numbers. Venezuela hasn't been able to maintain accounts in dollars and not even in euros in some cases. And the majority of correspondent bank has closed the accounts of some of the important institutions of Venezuela, the central bank, the development bank, the Centenario Bank, and Petróleo de Venezuela, and other institutions, public institutions in Venezuela. So I wanted to share with you some information from last week. It might have changed already. The Bank of England, Venezuelan gold, valued in euros, they're blocked by a decision of the bank. But following the government of the UK, who decided to join the strategy of the coup and recognize the fake president of Venezuela, 1.9 billion euros that were needed for Venezuelans to buy medicine, buy supplies, and they're blocked. Citibank here in the U.S. I can't pay my staff. We have to do miracles for that to happen. $196 million. In the Green of London, $473 million. In North Capital, $238 million. Of euros, sorry. 196 million euros, 238 million euros. In Novo Banco in Portugal, where we were allowed to do many transactions until the last sanctions that are even more criminal than the previous. 1.5 billion euros, which is $1.7 million. I paid the quota for FAO, and the salary of our, the quota for FAO, the salaries of our staff are there, or the money to pay for the distribution of food from clubs in Venezuela. We went to pay, and they stayed in the banks, and they didn't even pay, or did they return the money? Their money has been stolen. We've asked back the $750 million. This is not legal. This is money from the Venezuelan state for the Venezuelans, for health, for food, for housing for the Venezuelans, and we're taking legal action in the tribunals in these countries where the Venezuelan money has been blocked. Sumitomo, Japanese bank, 415 million euros. This is almost 5 billion euros cash. But figure what's the value of Citgo refineries here in the United States and of its assets. 30 billion would be low. And the money that we haven't been able to repatriate that was used for the development investment to produce more oil, export more oil, and have more income for Venezuela. That's there. Tens of thousands of million dollars. And if we do a projection of what we have not been able to produce or export by not having these supplies to produce, the multiplying effect that this blockade has, this is go for over billions of dollars. This is a brutal aggression against Venezuela. Other forms of aggression is a risk country factor. The classifiers would place us lower than any country in the world in development, even though we would pay on time. Venezuela in between 2013 and 2016, we paid $7 billion in debts and paid timely, yet the risk factor worsened. This, of course, has to be counted amongst the losses of the Venezuelan bonds in the market, and at least $1.5 billion between the exchanges of currencies, which is, how neoliberal, what a marvel. We can't even use the U.S. currency. So the affectation is of thousands of, hundreds of thousands of dollars. You don't even imagine how a shipment costs, and stops via Panama Canal. They would only do 1 or 2 stoppages. Now they has to stop 5 or 6 times, and we're paying insurance as if it was wartime insurance. It's outrageous. And everything that we were able to import is because we have the help of our allies. We met with the group of over 60 countries, in defense of this charter, in defense of the peace. They talked about, look, this is not the way. Look at Cuba, how many years of blockade, and they had to sign routes. And when we were able to pay, it's even more expensive. So we can't buy the same quantities to satisfy the needs of our country. Is that just? That's what we're denouncing here before the world. But I could also wanted to also say, but because we're denouncing this to the world, we're going to denounce this for every way possible. The president, in the next few days, is going to approve a mechanism to register each consequence of the blockade. So just like the Cubans have a way to count the effects of the blockade. It's terrible to say, but how many children have been died, and how many patients have died because we're not being able to import some supplies for the production. Yesterday we disappeared in the page of the website of the State Department. Today it disappeared. They disappeared it. For our surprise, faction U.S. actions in Venezuela. This is a report, basically, of the actions that the U.S. has taken against Venezuela. Here they say what they have done to overthrow the government of Venezuela. What have they done to make the Venezuelan government people suffer? This is basically evidence, the guilty evidence and irrefutable evidence. And if we could do a trial from here and we could show any justice system, the international criminal courts would say this, that they talk about the crisis in Venezuela, the sanctions, similar to what I just said to you right now. They're right here. The executive orders and 13807, the gold, the digital currencies. They list of one of the actions of the U.S. that the meetings that took place in the Security Council. They believe that the Lima Group is an accomplishment of the United States, but the United States doesn't belong to the Lima Group. But they put it here as one of the accomplishments of the U.S. The Lima Group was originally 12 countries. Now it's 14. Well, that doesn't matter. They support Guaidó. The exclusion of Venezuela that doesn't have any access from the Inter-American Development Bank. This is an accomplishment from the United States. But the most important is this. Look, key outcomes in 2019. The key outcomes, its pressure policy, this is the result. This is the concrete elements that have been the result of the actions of the United States. Where have they led? What have they led to? What have they produced? Well, Mr. Juan Guaidó announced his interim presidency under the Venezuelan Constitution. Though that's not here, but it says under the Venezuelan Constitution. Basically, that means that the result of the U.S. policy against Venezuela is that this gentleman proclaimed himself presidency, and then says that 54 countries have recognized him as president as a result of U.S. foreign policy, and that this man has named 36 representatives. Many of those countries don't know what to do with those representatives now, and some in Europe, some in Latin America, their declaration, because they don't really have any function. They can't do anything. They don't have an effective control. The only government that has the control is the real government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. After another achievement of foreign policy against Venezuela is that they received the credentials of Trump received the credentials of these men. They say here more than 1,000 members of the military of Venezuelan military have defected and have betrayed the country. They have gone to Colombia to receive UNHCR refuge. So they said that 1,000. I don't know where they get this number from, because our number is maybe a couple hundreds of low-ranking officers, and they're not being attended to in Colombia. They have been used as a shaver that you just throw out. CITGO is under the control. It says CITGO is under the control of the interim government. It's really under the control of the U.S. government. That's who's really took over right now. They're even asking for financing for CITGO. Why are they asking for? How can they ask debts from something that they're not that they don't control? This is shameful what they're doing. One of the key results, one of the key outcomes of the actions of the United States is the Venezuelan oil production fell to 736,000 barrels per day. That's not the number, but it has fallen down due to the fact we can't import the key supplies, key parts, that we don't have the strength of CITGO to invest in the national industry. Thanks to the blockade, thanks to that we're not able to trade with PDVSA due to the sanctions. But for them, this is an accomplishment that the Venezuelan oil production has fallen. How great it is that now Venezuela has less income and the people are suffering. That's the result, and they're proud of this. An estimate of 25 crude oil tankers with 12 million barrels remain stranded off the coasts of Venezuela, with difficulty finding buyers. Is it the sanctions? The people are running away from sanctions, and these are ships that were taking oil to Cuba, and they're now being blockaded. We're being warned about blockade. The diplomatic pressure resulted in fewer markets for Venezuelan gold. So, that's great. So now we can use the Venezuelan oil gold to buy medicine for our people, and they enjoy this. Bank, if in a determined country, cancel the gold exports, and to other countries they have falling, and they put this as an accomplishment. We could give you a copy of this. This is a coup. It's accomplishment that the military is betraying the country. These are the accomplishments the United States is talking about. That there's less oil production, that children are dying because they don't have access to medicine, that these are real consequences. This is indignant, and we see it from the heart. So we're going to resist with strength. And only the Venezuelan people will decide what to do and when to do it. We will insist in dialogue. This was in the Santo Domingo court. The opposition decided not to sign on 7th of February of last year. We're going to go together, opposition and government, to ask the U.S. government to end this cruel and inhumane policy against the people of Venezuela. But now we have to say that many people in the Venezuelan opposition are partly responsible for this. But if they're doing meetings in Washington to determine how the military intervention is going to take place in Venezuela, of course, Julio Borges, Tarre, Vecchio, Hausman, they're the authors of the sanctions, intellectual authors of the sanctions, and that the U.S. is carrying out. And lastly, we have to do we have denounced this particularly. There's 26 patients in Italy. In an agreement that Venezuela has with the foundation for a transplant that they're about to die because we haven't been able to pay 4 million euros to that foundation. We used to pay it from Citgo. Citgo was confiscated. Citgo doesn't pay it anymore. Now we're going to try to pay through PDVSA the transaction balance back. At least we got the money back, but we weren't able to pay. We tried to pay through another institution, but not only but we weren't able. We were not only just unable to pay, but they kept the money. So where does this end? How far does this go? How far is Donald Trump gonna go to make people suffer? I have a list here of I don't want to give the names, but here's some list of names. Moises, 8 years old. Claudia, 17 years old. Samuel, 17 years old. Carlos, 5 years old. Daniel, Marcelo, some over 50 years old. There's 26 that are suffering, and their lives are at risk because these are transplants, and if there's a rejection, then they need to get operated once again. And if we don't pay, here are the bills. Bill number 1 with PDVSA, bill number 2 from PDVSA to pay these 4 and so million euros. It's bill number 3 from PDVSA. This is from February. The first is from November last year, and then it's February. Novo Banco from Portugal. The amount for 4.8 million euros. February 22, 2019. Bone marrow, and then for bone marrow transplant. The result of the transactions, it was canceled. Here wasn't that we were able to pay, is that they were blocked. The amount was blocked. This amount of the people of Venezuela was blocked in Novo Banco. This is previous. There's another one, canceled, Novo Banco. We're going to make all this public, and we're going to put it on our website. I don't want to give any names. There's a gentleman here, Edgar. I'll just give him his name. He was evaluated 3 years ago in Pavia, Italy, because he has acute leukemia, and he received a transplant in 2017. But this moment he's in the hospital, and he has hepatitis C, a chronic hepatitis C. Both conditions that he presents can lead him to death if he does not continue his treatment in Italy. This family, for months, have been receiving donated food because they haven't been able to pay for the treatment. There's 2 mothers here. They're asking a letter to the embassy of embassy of Venezuela in Italy. But due to the complications for the transplant, we're scared that our children are receiving a treatment to counteract the complications, but these therapies are not available in Latin America. This mother is suffering because we can't pay for a foundation to do the bone marrow transplant. Do you think this is fair? So we're going to leave it to this. But we're denouncing this, and the way it happens in Italy, it happens also in Venezuela. There's a new report on the effects of the sanctions, the U.S. sanctions. They're talking about tens of thousands of deaths we have to due to the sanctions. We have to read it in detail, but we have to keep in mind if there was not a blockade against Venezuela, the Venezuelan economy could flourish. This is not Venezuelans and Chavistas talking about it. These are specialists that are citizens of the United States. I haven't read the report. I don't know what the sources are, but those are some of the ones that I saw.
Minister, for that lengthy. There's been a lot of attention paid to the Russian contingent in Venezuela. Could you just give us some details on how many Russians are there, what are they doing, what assistance are they giving? Just anything to clarify what's happening there would be appreciated. Thank you.
Saben ustedes que el equipamiento militar de
You know that the military equipment in Venezuela in the 70s was mostly from the U.S. It has some components, some airplanes from France, but mostly U.S. technology. In 2001, before the coup, before the sabotage, before it all, the U.S. had canceled the military cooperation in Venezuela then to find spare parts or to make overhauls to the F-16 and to tankers from Venezuela. It was impossible. So President Chavez went out to look to other powers who fabricate this equipment to protect ourselves from any aggression, and he went into Russia. And since 2001, we have a cooperation agreement with the Russian Federation. There have been purchases of military equipment, air, fuels. We have exchanges in the military sciences. Russians have gone to Venezuelans. Venezuela have gone to Russia. This time they arrive in a Russian aircraft, but this time to train our people how to use their helicopters, their tanks, and their equipment. They are in Venezuela, but for God's sake, that's not a contingent, as they said. Yes, we have a great alliance with Russia, but the U.S. is doing military exercises in neighbor countries, and they did them in Caribbean Sea and in the Amazonia. How many military bases does the U.S. have? How many do they have in Colombia? How many do they have around the world? How many centers for torture, clandestine, do they have? How many countries the city has dominated due to their military bases? How could they even question the military relations we have with any other country? Do they really think that the Monroe Doctrine is valid? And that this hemisphere, as they call, because in 1823 they divided the world into hemispheres that only they recognize, that this hemisphere is to be controlled by the U.S. exclusively. This is not like that. There are sovereign countries, not all of them, but there are some that are sovereign and independent. And we will have military cooperation with whomever we want. It is not the affair of any other state. We do not want to have alliances for war, but to defend peace in Venezuela, and we have the right to do so.
Any particular extra assistance at the moment in relation to trying to overcome the blockade, the U.S. blockade, as you call it?
En muchas áreas acaba de finalizar una.
Yes, in various areas. We just had a mixed commission in industrial area, in mining, and the peaceful use of outer space. In different areas of science, scientific and cultural even, we expanded our cooperation with the Russian Federation. And of course, in the military area, we will continue doing so to guarantee the defense and the peace of Venezuela. And yes, if the biggest army that humanity has ever known, as the U.S., as today's U.S. Army, threatens you with a military operation, its main speakers, wouldn't we have the right to defend ourselves and protect ourselves and to have the equipment to do so?
Dos preguntas. El día de hoy, el jefe adjunto del Departamento de Inteligencia rusa ha aseverado que Estados Unidos está llevando a cabo varias opciones para cambiar el gobierno del presidente Nicolás Maduro.
And especially with Cuba. And the second question is, today, the group of countries in defense of the charter met. We see that many more countries are joining. What concrete actions have been taken?
La Federación de Rusia no comparte inteligencia con nosotros.
The Russian Federation is sharing information with us. There are some elements they share with the news to avoid circumstances that we can regret. Effectively, it's not something that a Russian general says. We thank him for the information, but it's something that Mike Pence has said himself at the Security Council. Bolton said it also in a political campaign rally, you know, that for winning the elections in Florida and so that Mr. Trump be reelected, he needs to get that state, Florida, and then they have to attack Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. They need to ensure the support in Florida. It's outrageous that they make an entire people suffer just to win an election. They have their own ways for reaching their means. Then effectively, there are informations. Even President Maduro himself last year, after the frustrated attempt of assassination, he gave the location in the North Department of Santander, in Chinacota, in the farm Talancota, the names of the persons who participated, the military who have been captured, and those who have been captured provided this information, even a deputy from the National Assembly. Then in another area of that same state in Colombia, we have detected training of Venezuelans and Colombians in Venezuelan uniforms to attack Venezuela. That very same day of the show and the spectacle of the humanitarian aid in the border, there were some military, well, I don't know if they were military, they had uniforms of military, and they wanted to come inside our country, violating with arms our territory. But even President Duque didn't agree to that action from his territory. It was already enough that Molotov cocktails were thrown from that side of the border to Venezuela when the border was closed. And at that point, they didn't get. But there was sufficient evidence. As the New York Times provided this information on the humanitarian aid, in which it was proven that it was burned from the Colombian side, there are many information in the last days through U.S. media. Since many of the press, they do not believe on the information, official information provided by Venezuela, then they might have to await until a U.S. media issues this information and share this information. Today's meeting, extraordinary meeting, great meeting. They are not only supporting Venezuela or protecting Venezuela through the charter, the UN charter. It is not with planes, it is not with missiles, it is not with weapons of mass destruction or nuclear weapons, which have only been used by the U.S. government and the U.S. Army against civilian population. No other country. It is not with that. Our only weapon is the UN Charter and their respect to the Venezuelan Constitution. But if I take out the Venezuelan Constitution, I could put the Cuban Constitution, which have just recently been adopted, or the Nicaraguan one, or any other country in the Middle East, or any other country in Asia or in Africa who are also being threatened as Venezuela. They want to impede war. They want to forbid the imposition of governments through violence and not through the ballots. There's a whole set of actions. There will be a ministerial meeting of the non-aligned movement in July in Venezuela, and most likely we will do a meeting there if we cannot do it before then. We were discussing this today in the morning in this group. There's another group of countries who have been also subjected to these sanctions, and we are sharing information about how to overcome these the consequences of sanctions, so that we can overcome them together. We're working with the UN, and we're bringing this information to them, all these denounces we're doing. There have been various proposals that I cannot tell at this point, because we are still under discussion. Next week, the group will meet once again to try to finalize these proposals. Mr. President, there's some people carrying some demonstrations in front of the U.S. Embassy in Washington, the Venezuelan Embassy in Washington. They said that your government gave them the key. Why was this done? And do you think they're violating any sort of law? A couple of weeks ago, our building in the U.S. Embassy, two of them were taken, and there's the main headquarters where our embassy is at, where the OAS mission also was working at. You know that our basis is the support from progressive movements, from social groups, and they have proposed themselves for legal actions to protect the Venezuelan properties. They are assisting in this regard, and their assistance is very much welcomed because we have to protect through legality and legal means. It is a violation of the Convention on Diplomatic Relations of Vienna, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, what they do with the consulate here in New York and what they do with the buildings of the military attaché. We have to protect that building. How crazy would it be? Have we proposed something of this nature to their embassy in Caracas? If they actually do this, then we have to think of how to reciprocate. I hope this does not happen. I hope that these friends who have been protecting their embassy in peace could actually go to their houses because the U.S. decides to fulfill their responsibilities on the basis of international law. It is a preventive action that they have taken and that we respect.
Of Iran charter from that airline, and they traveled to Venezuela. And that is the real information. I mean,
the breaking of diplomatic relations that President Maduro decided on 23 February this year, it was carried out immediately. And the diplomatic agents of our bilateral embassy with the U.S., they went back to Venezuela that very same week. All of them are in Venezuela. Our withdrawal from the OAS, we follow their statutes and the provisions of its charter. It will become valid as of the 27th of April when President Maduro signed the letter that was handed to the Secretary General of the OAS. And after you make that denounce of the charter, you have 2 years. And after those 2 year carry is when your membership expires. So we are full members of the OAS until Saturday, when there will be a big celebration in Venezuela, because we have finally left the OAS as part of an exercise of our democracy. And our team to the OAS will go back to Venezuela next week. Thank you, Mr. President. In your statement yesterday, you discussed about other countries who are being sanctioned as Cuba and Iran. You met with the Minister of Iran. Could you provide more details about that meeting and what actions are you taking to overcome this blockade against Venezuela? As I have told the countries from various regions, China, Cuba, Russia, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, many of those countries are under blockades and sanctions. And they all have different experiences. How many years does Cuba have? Over 50 years. Iran has a couple of other years. And they have learned how to overcome, to do justice, and to accomplish doing their transactions despite the blockade. We're sharing information, methodologies, how have you done it, how have you achieved it, so that we can also work in the very same direction. It is not fair, I insist. Although no one has asked about the information I provided at the very beginning, the people is suffering the effects of the blockade. That report that was issued today by U.S. experts, it talks about hundreds of dead people. There's a big consequence, a big toll on the people. They have tried to impose that free healthcare, nutrition, housing for the people. These rights have failed. You know that President Trump has started an ideology campaign against socialism. I do not understand really how they interpret socialism in the U.S., but in our country, socialism, which is not for exporting, it is our very own model. And at this stage of resistance, we're going to the offensive, and we will see our model being strengthened in the coming years, and not only achieving, but also overcoming the human development, because we're learning to overcome the injustice and the blockade of these measures. Thank you. Llama. You met about the possibility of Guaidó naming a representative to the UN. What did the SG said? With the Secretary General, we only talk about factual things and things that could happen, that could actually happen. We reviewed and we made an analysis of the regional dynamics, his concerns. We discussed about dialogue. We have always been We have sat once again. We are awaiting on the White House to give authorization to the Venezuelan opposition so they sit down to have a dialogue with us. Those are the important topics we discuss with the Secretary General about multilateralism. Never would it be a part of a conversation with the Secretary General, an issue that is being attempted to be imposed by the U.S. Very important. Indeed, this group wants to avoid that the systematic violation of the principles and purposes of this charter, unilateral decisions, criminal decisions of the U.S. against Venezuela result in a regime change by force in Venezuela. That's the intention of this group. Why? Why countries from Asia or Africa? Not only because we have a good bilateral relation, but they fear that if we do not stop this, then this may happen once again, not with Venezuela, but in this stage of regime change, and we're working together. We are looking at ways for them to support the Venezuelan economy, how to work together these processes to bypass sanctions and the blockade of the U.S. And we are looking at how to defend and uphold international law. It's not that Mr. Pence could come, sit down with, to say that we are going to make the world to not recognize the credentials and telling you, ambassador, cannot be seated there. It's the supremacism, the arrogance of the U.S. will not impose because they are a minority. here every state is sovereign and equal, the principle of equality of states, and despite all extortions against small states, they will not be able to coerce them. Then thank you very much.